Gospel lesson always comes close to the Feast of the Nativity. It's called for on the Sunday of or the Sunday before the conception by St. Anna and St. Joachim of the Virgin Mary. So the church places this gospel at this time close to the Nativity every year. But it may be hard to see what exactly the healing of this woman has to do with the Nativity or with the conception of the Virgin Mary. But I think if we dig into it, we can find some close relationships. First of all, let's just talk about what the idea of the Sabbath means. Why was it important and why was it a big deal that Christ was healing on the Sabbath? Sabbath as a word doesn't necessarily hit us across the head in English like it might in Greek. You know, we call the seventh day of the week Saturday, named after the pagan Roman god Saturn, kind of the Roman version of Zeus. But in Greek, we call that day Sabbato, which means Sabbath. And the Sabbath was the seventh day of the week. The word means rest. And the first time we see that connection between the seventh day and rest is early on in the scriptures. It's in Genesis chapter 2, verse 2 through 3. It says, "On the seventh day, God finished his work, which he had done, and he rested on the seventh day from all his works, which he had done. So God blessed the seventh day and hallowed it, because on it God rested from all his works, which he had done." So this is the first meaning of rest that we associate with the Sabbath, which is to enter into this rest that God had at the end of the first 6 days of creation. This represents a period of rest, a transition in the creative work of God from the first 6 days. We don't necessarily consider them strict 24-hour periods. But so the seventh day is this time after the sixth day. God looks around at creation. He says everything's good. He even says man is very good. And then he rests. But we weren't resting. We went about as quickly as possible trying to destroy the creation that he had made for us. So God would have to act again in creation later on. But so this rest wasn't permanent. In fact, the Jews understood 3 types of rest associated with this idea of Sabbath. And the second one is the foundation behind the law of keeping the Sabbath. And Moses tells us about this, that they keep the Sabbath because God freed them from the slavery of the Egyptians. So that was the rest from slavery. And he references this in Deuteronomy as he's recalling the 10 Commandments near the end of his life to the people. In chapter 5, verse 15, he says, "You shall remember that you were a servant in the land of Egypt, and the Lord your God brought you out thence with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm. Therefore, the Lord your God commanded you to keep the Sabbath day." So this is the reason behind why the Jews kept the Sabbath, was because of a remembrance of the freedom given to them by God and his act of love in freeing them from the Egyptians at Passover or Pascha. The third type of rest that they associated with this word had to do with the messianic promise of an eternal rest that the Messiah would bring to them. And if you want to read further about that, St. Paul does this beautifully in chapter 4 of Hebrews. But for now, we've established that the Sabbath is rest. It happened on the seventh day of the week, on Saturday, and that there were 3 ideas of rest associated with it. On the Sabbath, the faithful were banned from doing any sort of work. But over the centuries, many interpretations had developed of what it meant to keep the Sabbath. One of these was that you couldn't heal on the Sabbath. This was considered work. But Christ in the gospel today shows us that many of these specific interpretations had begun to miss the point of the Sabbath. In the story, there's a woman who's been bent low for 18 years. And again, in English, that may not jump out at us, But in Greek, we say 18 as 10 και 8, so 10 and 8. And St. Ambrose of Milan, in his commentary on Luke, we actually commemorated St. Ambrose yesterday. But in his commentary on Luke, he says that the 10, the deca, represents the 10 Commandments, the law. And the 8 represents grace through the resurrection. So now, we spent a lot of time talking about this idea of the seventh-day Sabbath. Where does this 8 come in, right? In our faith, we believe, and I think this story hints along these lines, that the life of Christ is the 8th day of creation. God became active again in Christ. From his birth, through his life, through his ministry, his death, and his resurrection, Christ changed the universe as much as he did on any of the first 6 days of creation. We can sometimes reduce our salvation down to the point of the resurrection, but truly the incarnation was a cosmic event. Behind us, we see here the icon of the Platitera, which means more spacious than the heavens. And this icon reminds us that God, who is uncontainable, he's everywhere, he became contained in the womb of the Virgin Mary. He who created everything became himself created. God, who is holy, which means different, it means other, right? He became like us in every way, taking on everything that we are. We dismiss the magnitude of the mystery of the incarnation because it's a story we've heard our entire lives. But truly, it is an awesome event. In the incarnation, God joined his holiness to our humanity in a way that had never happened before. And in doing so, he created a pathway for our salvation. Everything that he took on about us could be saved through his life, his death, and his resurrection. So this is a monumental change to the universe, just as monumental as the creation of life or the sun and the stars. We who were cut off and were disconnected from God became intimately connected to him in the person of the Christ child born of the Virgin Mary. His life is like the first 7 days of creation, a great act of love of God for us. He gave the Jews the law out of love to help them to live in a way that would point them towards righteousness. But as we see in the story today, through legalism, the law became a weight, a burden that was bending low the people. And Christ, in his grace and love, would heal the people and provide a rest which is eternal, the eternal rest that was looked for by the people of Israel. Another parallel to this idea of legalism separating us from God and his grace healing us comes in the story of the conception of the Virgin Mary, which we'll celebrate tomorrow. When Joachim and Anna had been married for 50 years, they were still childless. Now, they were faithful. In fact, from the time when he was 15, Joachim had given, and Anna had lived off only a third of their wealth or their income. A third they gave to the poor, and a third they gave to the temple. And God had blessed them. His flocks had multiplied, so they felt really blessed, but they were still sad because they were childless. And on this 50th wedding anniversary, they had gone to the temple to give their contribution, but the high priest Issachar turned them away. He said, "Your childless hands are not worthy to offer a gift to God." And the other people pushed them away and pushed them in front of them. And they were very upset about this. They looked, and they couldn't find in the genealogy anyone who had been blessed by God and was still childless. So they were very concerned. They prayed to God, and they left it in his hands, that he would work in them the same miracle that he had worked for Abraham and Sarah, and give them a child to comfort them in their old age. Joachim was so upset that he took his flocks, he went into the mountains, and he refused to come back because he was so humiliated. But Anna stayed in her garden and prayed, and God sent the archangel Gabriel to each one of them, And he gave them tidings of the birth of a daughter, most blessed, by whom all the nations of the earth will be blessed, and through whom will come the salvation of the world. Each promised to dedicate their child to be raised in the temple as a holy vessel of God. And the archangel told Joachim to return home, where he would find his wife waiting for him in the city gate. And Anna he told to wait at the gate. And when they saw one another, they embraced. And if you've ever seen the icon of the conception for tomorrow, it's a picture of Joachim and Anna embracing under this gate. So that's that story. But much like in the gospel today, Joachim and Anna were turned away because of legalism. But they were healed by the grace of God. They were faithful. They were sharing what they had in love with the church and with the poor. They weren't living by the letter of the law. They weren't only giving 10%. They were giving, 66% of what they had. But the high priest Issachar was a hypocrite. Like the synagogue leader in the story today, he knew the words of the law and the interpretations of them, but he didn't know God. He didn't know love, and he didn't see the love behind the laws. Christ didn't come and teach against the laws. He taught against the hypocrisy of the application of the laws without love. In our church today, we have many rules. We have rules about fasting and baptism and marriage and all kinds of things. Those rules are there to help us to grow closer to God. And if they get in the way of our relationship with God, we, with humility, approach our priest or our bishop, and we ask for their guidance. And they, understanding both the law and God's love, apply economia as appropriate to our situation, understanding that those rules are not there. We're not here for the rules, but the rules are there for us. And that way, we can have rules to guide us without becoming legalistic in our approach towards God. So one more connection in the gospel today between this story and the nativity. And this comes in the beasts that Christ mentions in the story. He talks about two animals, the donkey and the ox. And if you look at any icon of the nativity of our church, you'll see two animals overlooking Christ's manger. And according to Holy Tradition, these were the only two animals that were present in the manger. That was the donkey and the ox. And where does this connection come from? Well, there was a messianic prophecy that Isaiah made in chapter 1, verse 3. He said, "The ox knows his master, and the donkey his master's crib. But Israel does not know me, and the people have not regarded me." So during this time, as we prepare for the awesome event of the Incarnation, we should strive to remember God and his love for us, because if we don't know him, then our fasting and our celebration is hypocrisy. If we seek him and we love him and we know him, then the Feast of the Nativity is an inspiration for us to follow the example of St. Joachim and Anna, sharing freely the gifts that God has given to us, loving each other, and faithfully worshiping him in this time of great joy.